Are you enjoying these untold Sherlock Holmes stories? If so, you can listen to even more exclusive Untold Sherlock Holmes adventures on my Patreon. Do check it out. The link is in the description below. It was in the sweltering, oppressive days of late July, in a year marked by an unusual alignment of the celestial spheres, that my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves entangled in a most singular and arcane mystery. London was baking under a relentless brassy sun, the heat magnified by the ambient magical exhaust of the great ether factories lining the Thames. The shimmering mirages that danced upon the cobblestones of Baker Street seemed almost to possess a life of their own, coalescing into phantom shapes of goblins and wyverns before dissolving back into the stifling summer air. I had spent the morning languidly reading the Thaumaturgical Telegraph, nursing an old injury from my days as an army chirurgeon in the Goblin Wars, while Holmes busied himself at his chemical and alchemical table. He was engaged in a complex distillation involving powdered manticore horn and a luminous, sapphire-coloured reagent that hissed and spat azure sparks whenever he agitated the glass retort. The properties of manticore venom are profoundly misunderstood by Scotland Yard's so-called experts, Holmes murmured, not taking his eyes from the bubbling concoction. Lestrade believes it is a simple corrosive, but when properly titrated with a tincture of moon lotus, it reveals traces of illusion magic that would otherwise remain undetectable. But I fear, Watson, that my experiments are but a meagre distraction from the utter stagnation of the criminal underworld. The city's rogues have wilted in this heat. Perhaps it is for the best, I replied, setting down my paper. The constabulary could use a respite, and frankly, Holmes, so could you. Your arcane energies are not inexhaustible. Holmes sighed, a sharp, restless exhalation, and set his beaker down. My mind rebels at stagnation, Watson. Give me problems. Give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram, or the most intricate magical binding, and I am in my proper atmosphere. But this prolonged exhaustion of the city's villainy, it is intolerable. As if summoned by his very complaint, a heavy, dragging footstep sounded upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up, followed by a polite but weary knock upon our door. "Enter!" called Holmes, his eyes suddenly bright with the predatory gleam of a hawk sighting its quarry. The man who crossed our threshold was a striking figure, though he appeared to be operating at the very limits of his physical endurance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed the deeply tanned, weather-beaten complexion of a mariner who had spent his life exposed to the fierce astral winds and scouring arcane storms of the upper atmospheres. He wore the brass-buttoned coat of an ethership merchant captain, though the garments hung somewhat loosely upon his formidable frame, as if he had recently lost a considerable amount of weight. But it was his face that arrested my attention. The captain's eyes were sunken and ringed with heavy purplish shadows. His skin, though bronzed by the sun, possessed an underlying sickly pallor. He moved with the slow, deliberate sluggishness of a man wading through a waist-deep marsh, and as he sank heavily into the armchair I offered him, he looked for all the world like a man hovering on the precipice of death. "You must forgive my intrusion, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the man rumbled, his voice a gravelly baritone that seemed to require an immense effort to produce. "My name is Captain Elias Thorne. I am the master of the Windrunner, a heavy frigate of the East Indian Trading Company. I have come to you because the clerics and healers of St. Mungo's can find nothing wrong with my humours or my spirit. Yet I am dying of exhaustion. I fear a curse, Mr. Holmes, a dark, insidious hex that is draining the very life-force from my marrow. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his long, thin fingers together, his sharp grey eyes darting over the captain's person, taking in 100-minute details in the span of a single breath. "A curse is a weighty accusation, Captain Thorne," Holmes said smoothly. "But before we delve into the realm of necromancy and hexes, let us observe the physical realm. I perceive from the faint residue of shimmering silver dust upon your right cuff that you have recently overseen a cargo of starlight silk from the Elven Isles. The faint scent of ozone clinging to your coat suggests your vessel operates on a thundercore rather than a standard ether engine. And the fresh, untarnished golden binding band upon your left ring finger tells me that you have been married for less than 6 months." Captain Thorne's weary eyes widened in astonishment. "By the Maker, it is exactly as they say. You are a sorcerer yourself, Mr. Holmes." "I am merely an observer, Captain. Magic leaves its traces, but so do the mundane actions of men. It is the intersection of the two that is my specialty. But pray, tell us of this exhaustion. When did it begin?" "It began 3 weeks ago, shortly after the Windrunner docked at the Thames High mooring," Thorne began, passing a heavy hand over his face. "We brought in a routine haul, silks, dwarven iron, and spices from the outer rim. Since my return, I have been residing at my home in Kensington with my wife, Morwenna. The first few days were joyous, as one might expect for a newlywed returning from a perilous 3-month voyage. But then the lethargy set in." Thorne leaned forward, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Mr. Holmes, I am a man who has stood at the helm of a ship for 4 days and 4 nights straight, battling the spectral typhoons of the howling sea without a wink of sleep. I know my own constitution, yet now I retire to my bed at 10 o'clock every evening and sleep until 10 o'clock the following morning. 12 solid hours of slumber, Mr. Holmes. And yet, when I wake, I feel as though I have been beaten with iron rods. My muscles ache, my mind is a thick, impenetrable fog, and I can scarcely muster the strength to walk from my parlour to my study. The healers have tested me for vampiric siphoning, parasitic wraiths, and even the common ague. They found nothing. I am perfectly healthy, they say. Yet I am wasting away." 12 hours is indeed a profoundly long rest, I noted, my medical curiosity piqued. "Do you experience dreams, night terrors? It is possible for one to sleep without achieving restorative rest if the mind is plagued by psychic disturbances." "No dreams, Doctor. That is the strangest part of it. The moment my head touches the pillow, it is as though I am plunged into a deep, black void. I remember nothing until the morning light strikes my face, and even then rousing myself is a Herculean task." "Fascinating," murmured Holmes, his eyes gleaming. "And tell me, Captain Thorne, during this period of deep unconsciousness, are you easily woken? If a carriage were to crash outside your window, or a thunderclap were to strike the roof, would you stir?" "My wife tells me I sleep like a stone golem. She says she has accidentally dropped a brass basin in our bedchamber, and I did not so much as twitch." Holmes sprang from his chair and began to pace the length of the sitting-room, his hands clasped behind his back. A deep, dreamless void, utter insensibility to sound, profound morning lethargy. The symptoms are distinct, Watson. Distinct and highly suggestive. He stopped and wheeled upon the captain. Captain Thorne, do you partake of any food or drink before retiring to bed? A glass of port, a dwarven ale, perhaps a medicinal draught? Nothing medicinal, Thorne replied, shaking his head slowly. I am a man of simple habits. After supper I sit in my study to review my ledgers and the ship's manifests. Around 9:30, Morwenna brings me a cup of black coffee from the kitchen. I drink it, we speak for a few moments, and then the overwhelming weariness overtakes me, and I go to bed. Who prepares this coffee? Morwenna herself. She insists upon it. She says it is a small comfort she can provide her weary husband. She brews it over the hearth and brings it to me with her own hands. Is the coffee procured from a regular merchant? Yes, a respectable grocer in the Strand. We have used the same blend since we were wed. Holmes's eyes narrowed into slits. Captain, I require you to do something for me tonight. I shall provide you with a vial of refined bezoar extract. Drink the coffee, but immediately swallow this extract. It will neutralize the lotus, while allowing you to seamlessly mimic the magically induced slumber. Go to bed, but keep your eyes and ears open. Will you do this? Captain Thorne looked bewildered, a flicker of defensive anger rising in his tired eyes. Mr. Holmes, you cannot possibly be suggesting that my Morwenna, that my wife, is poisoning me. It is monstrous. She is the gentlest, most devoted woman in all of Londinium. She weeps to see me in this state. I am suggesting nothing, Captain, Holmes replied soothingly, though his tone brokered no argument. I merely wish to eliminate all variables. If the coffee is entirely innocent, then we shall look elsewhere. Perhaps the porcelain of the cup itself is cursed. But if you wish me to solve this mystery and save your life, you must follow my instructions to the letter. Thorne hesitated, his jaw clenching, but the sheer desperation in his exhausted frame won out. Very well, I will do as you ask. I will empty the cup tonight. Excellent. Remain in your bed and do not alert her to your wakefulness. Wait until Dr. Watson and I send word that the affair is concluded. Now, one final question before you depart. As master of the Windrunner, who holds the keys to the ship's hold? Thorne frowned at the abrupt change of subject. I do, naturally. The master keys are forged from cold iron and bound to my specific bio-magical signature. No one else can open the main cargo hatches without triggering a warding siren that would wake half the docks. And where do you keep these keys? They never leave my person, Thorne said, reaching a hand beneath his collar to extract a heavy silver chain. At the end of it hung a cluster of strange, jagged iron keys that hummed with a faint, barely perceptible magical resonance. I sleep with them around my neck. I see, Holmes said softly, a tight smile playing upon his thin lips. They never leave your person. Yes, that is very instructive. Thank you, Captain Thorne. You may return home now. Remember my instructions tonight. Your life, and perhaps much more, depends upon your vigilance. When the weary captain had taken his leave, Holmes turned to me, his eyes dancing with that familiar manic energy that always accompanied a breakthrough in his deductions. "Well, Watson, what do you make of our tired captain?" "It is a peculiar case," I admitted, reaching for my pipe and a pinch of enchanted glowing-leaf tobacco. If he is not being poisoned, I would suspect a parasitic astral entity has attached itself to his aura during his voyage. But your line of questioning regarding the coffee suggests you suspect the wife. My dear Watson, it is an elementary deduction of alchemical pathology. A man of robust health suddenly succumbs to a death-like, dreamless torpor exactly 12 hours in duration, accompanied by severe muscle fatigue and mental fog. These are not the symptoms of a curse nor of astral parasites. They are the exact textbook pharmacological effects of Somnium Lotus, a rare and highly regulated alchemical narcotic harvested from the swamps of the Underdark. It induces a state indistinguishable from a minor magical coma. Taken in small doses, it is a sleep aid. Taken in heavy daily doses, it accumulates in the blood and leaves the victim utterly drained of vitality. "But his wife," I protested. "Why would a newlywed woman systematically poison her husband just to make him sleep? If she wished him dead, she could use arsenic or powdered basilisk fang." "Precisely, Watson. She does not wish him dead. She merely wishes him unconscious, and not just unconscious, but insensible. Completely dead to the world, deaf to a crashing carriage or a dropped basin." Holmes paced over to his desk, grabbing his coat and an elegant walking stick concealing a wand of pure rowan wood. If a person is rendered entirely immobile and unconscious, and they wear a set of magically bound keys around their neck, what becomes possible? The realization struck me like a physical blow. The keys! The warding requires his biomagical signature. If she removes the keys from his neck, the magic might recognize they are separated from the master. "Not necessarily," Holmes countered, his eyes shining. "The cold iron keys are bound to his aura, yes, but aura residue lingers. If a key is taken from the master's body, it will retain enough of his magical signature to bypass the ship's wards for approximately 3 to 4 hours before the signature fades and the wards reset. It is a known loophole in cheap East India Company warding locks." "Good heavens," I breathed. "She drugs him to a stupor so deep he cannot feel her lifting the heavy silver chain from his neck. She takes the keys, leaves the house, and has 3 hours to use them before she must return them to his person." "Brilliant, Watson. You have hit the very centre of the target. She drugs him at 9:30. He is unconscious by 10. She takes the keys, ventures out into the night, and returns before dawn, replacing the chain around his neck. He wakes at 10 in the morning, exhausted from the lingering effects of the lotus, none the wiser." "But what is she doing with the keys? The ship's hold is filled with mundane goods, silks and iron." "That is the narrative the EIC presents to the harbour masters. But a heavy frigate like the Windrunner traverses the perilous astral straits and the shadow reefs. There are hidden compartments in such vessels, Watson, smugglers' holds. What she is extracting from that ship is the true heart of our mystery. Come, Watson, the game is afoot. Slip your revolver into your pocket and ensure your wand is fully charged. We are going to the Thames High Mooring tonight." The Thames High Mooring was a marvel of Victorian engineering and arcane architecture. Massive pylons of enchanted steel rose from the dark, sluggish waters of the river, supporting a vast network of aerial docks suspended in the sky by repulsor fields. The great ether ships, their vast levitation balloons deflated and resting on top of their wooden hulls, were tethered to iron rings the size of omnibuses. The air here was thick with the smell of river mud, ozone from the ether engines, and the exotic spices that had spilled onto the wooden planks. Holmes and I arrived shortly before midnight, concealed beneath heavy, charm-woven cloaks that cast a subtle perception-filtering glamour over us. We navigated the labyrinth of towering cargo crates, stacked like the stone blocks of some ancient pyramid, until Holmes found a suitable vantage point overlooking Pier 4, where the Windrunner was moored. The ship was a majestic beast, even at rest. Her hull was constructed of dark, spell-treated ironwood, and her massive sails were neatly furled. The pier was deserted, save for a solitary mechanical watchman, a clockwork automaton that paced a repetitive route along the far end of the dock, its brass gears clicking softly in the humid night. "We wait," Holmes whispered, crouching behind a crate stencilled with dwarven runes. "If the captain successfully avoided the draft tonight, his wife will assume he is safely comatose. She will not miss an opportunity to move her illicit cargo." We remained in our cramped position for over an hour. The heat was stifling, and my injured leg began to throb with a dull ache, but Holmes remained as rigid and unmoving as a gargoyle, his intense gaze fixed upon the gangway of the Windrunner. Just after the great clock tower of Westminster chimed 1 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence of the docks was broken by the quiet clopping of a horse's hooves. A hired hansom cab rolled out of the swirling ether fog at the end of the pier and came to a halt. From the cab stepped a woman. She was clad in a heavy, dark travelling cloak, the hood pulled up to obscure her features, but as she passed beneath the glow of a phosphor gas street lamp, I caught a glimpse of her face. It was undeniably Morwenna Thorne, strikingly beautiful, with pale skin and sharp aristocratic features, but her eyes held a cold, calculating hardness that completely belied the gentle, devoted wife the captain had described. She was not alone. From the shadows of the alleyway opposite the pier, 3 figures emerged to meet her. They were large, hulking brutes, half-orcs by the look of their protruding lower tusks and heavy brows, dressed in the rough canvas and leather of dockside enforcers. "You're late, lady," grunted one of the half-orcs, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "The fence is waiting at the slaughterhouse. The goods better be ready." "Hold your tongue, Garl," Morwenna snapped, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. Gone was any trace of upper-class refinement. She spoke with the sharp, commanding edge of a seasoned criminal. "My fool of a husband was restless tonight. I had to wait until the lotus fully took hold before I could lift the chain." She reached into her cloak and drew forth the heavy silver chain. Even from our distance I could see the faint, pulsing blue light emanating from the cold iron keys. "The aura is fading," she muttered, hurrying toward the gangway of the Windrunner. "We have barely 2 hours. Follow me and keep quiet." Holmes touched my arm, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "Now, Watson," silent as shadows. We crept from our hiding place, following the smugglers up the creaking wooden gangway. The deck of the Windrunner was dark and silent. Morwenna led her hired thugs toward the aft of the ship, bypassing the main cargo hatch and instead kneeling before a heavy, iron-bound trapdoor, flush with the deckboards. The door was inscribed with glowing, crimson warding runes that hummed with a dangerous, lethal energy. Morwenna did not flinch. She grasped the largest of the cold iron keys, the one pulsing with her husband's stolen magical signature, and pressed it into the centre of the runic circle. There was a sharp hiss, like a dying snake, and the crimson glow of the runes flared brilliantly for a second, before shifting to a docile, placid blue. The magical locks disengaged with a series of heavy metallic clacks. "Open it," she ordered. The half-orcs heaved the heavy trapdoor open, revealing a dark, narrow ladder descending into the ship's secret bilge-hold. Morwenna lit a small globule of mage light and descended, followed by the brutes. Holmes and I hurried to the edge of the open hatch, peering down into the gloom. The hold was small, clearly designed to bypass standard customs inspections. Within it rested 6 heavily lead-lined lockboxes. "Get them up," Morwenna commanded. "Be gentle. If you crack the casing on one of these, the necrotic backwash will strip the flesh from your bones before you can scream." My blood ran cold. Necrotic backwash. "Good God, Holmes," I breathed, barely making a sound. "What is in those boxes?" "Soul gems, Watson," Holmes whispered back, his face grim. "Illegally harvested from the battlefields of the Eastern Marches. Highly restricted, immensely powerful, and worth a king's ransom on the black market to illicit necromancers and dark artificers. Our devoted Mrs. Thorne is not merely a smuggler. She is a lieutenant in a highly lucrative and deeply vile magical syndicate." As the half-orcs began to haul the first of the lead-lined boxes up the ladder, Holmes stood up from the hatch, throwing off his glamour cloak. In the dim light of the harbour, he looked like an avenging spirit. "I think, Mrs. Thorne," Holmes's voice rang out, cold and sharp as a tempered steel blade, "that those boxes would be better left exactly where they are." Morwenna whipped her head upward, her eyes widening in shock. "Who are you? Garl, kill them!" The half-orc nearest the ladder roared, dropping the crate and drawing a massive serrated falchion from his back. He lunged upward, trying to vault onto the deck. I did not hesitate. Drawing my service revolver, I fired. The bullet, inscribed with runes of stunning by a dwarven gunsmith I favoured, struck the brute squarely in the shoulder. A burst of concussive force exploded upon impact, throwing the massive half-orc backward into the hold, where he crashed into his companions. Morwenna, however, was not so easily subdued. With a shriek of rage, she thrust her hands forward. A crackle of emerald lightning erupted from her fingertips, arcing directly toward Holmes's chest. But Holmes was faster. With a flick of his wrist, his rowan wand was in his hand. He slashed it through the air, murmuring a harsh counter-incantation. A shield of translucent, shimmering silver materialized before him. The emerald lightning struck the shield and deflected upward, shattering a portion of the ship's rigging in a shower of burning splinters. "A respectable casting of the fulminating hex, Mrs. Thorne," Holmes observed, stepping forward calmly. "But your technique is sloppy, and your reliance on raw emotion over focus is your undoing. Kineticus." A pulse of kinetic force shot from Holmes's wand, striking Morwenna squarely in the chest. She was thrown backward against the bulkhead of the hold, the stolen keys clattering from her grasp and ringing against the iron floorboards. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to keep your weapon trained on the gentleman in the pit," Holmes requested, stepping down the ladder to retrieve the keys. "Gladly, Holmes." I stood over the hatch, levelling my revolver at the 3 groaning half-orcs, who, seeing the glowing runes on the barrel of my gun and the authoritative stance of a military man, decided further resistance was unwise. Holmes bound Morwenna's wrists with a pair of ensorcelled manacles he had produced from his coat pocket. They glowed faintly, suppressing any further attempts at spell-casting. "It is over, Morwenna," Holmes said, his tone devoid of triumph, holding only a clinical detachment. "Your syndicate's operation is dismantled. The harbour guard, whom I took the liberty of notifying via a thaumaturgic messenger bird an hour ago, should be arriving at the end of the pier momentarily." True to his word, the heavy pounding of boots and the shrill blast of brass whistles sounded from the docks. A dozen armoured constables of the magical law enforcement squad surged up the gangway, wands drawn and halberds ready. It was nearly dawn when we returned to Baker Street. The sky above London was a bruised purple, the heat of the previous day finally breaking to allow a cool, damp breeze to drift through the open windows of our sitting room. Captain Elias Thorne sat in our armchair, a cup of strong, undrugged tea trembling in his hands. The deep shadows under his eyes were still present, but the oppressive, sluggish fog that had clouded his features was already beginning to lift. Holmes had just finished explaining the night's events to him. Thorne stared into his teacup, a broken man. "She never loved me," he whispered, the words carrying the heavy weight of profound betrayal. "It was a ruse, a calculated performance from the very day we met at the Admiralty Ball." "I am afraid so, Captain," Holmes said gently, a rare note of genuine sympathy in his voice. "She targeted you precisely because you were a captain of an EIC vessel that frequented the eastern marches, and because your lock keys were bound to your aura. She needed a conduit to smuggle the soul gems past the London ward nets. You were not a husband to her, sir. You were a master key." Thorne closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a track through the dust and weariness on his face. "And the exhaustion? I truly thought I was dying." "The Somnium Lotus is insidious," Holmes explained, lighting his pipe. "She had to drug you into an unnaturally deep coma so she could physically remove the chain from your neck without waking you. She would leave the house, rendezvous with her accomplices, utilize your lingering aura on the keys to bypass the ship's wards, empty the hold and return the keys to your neck before dawn. The cumulative effect of the Lotus was sapping your life force. Had this continued for another fortnight, your heart would have simply stopped under the strain." Thorne's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "She smiled at me, Mr. Holmes. Every night she kissed my cheek and poured that poison. I feel as though my very soul has been hollowed out." He took a shuddering breath, forcing his hands to unclench. "But you saved my life. I do not know how to repay you." "Your recovery is payment enough, Captain Thorne. That and the knowledge that a considerable quantity of illegal soul magic has been removed from the streets of our city." Holmes turned toward the window, watching the first golden rays of the sun pierce the London fog. "The heart is a fragile thing, Captain, but the human spirit is resilient. The sea calls to you still. Return to the Windrunner. Let the astral winds blow away the memory of this treachery." When the captain had finally departed, his step heavy but his posture resolute, carrying the invisible weight of a shattered life that he was determined to rebuild, I looked over at Holmes. "A brilliant piece of deduction, Holmes, from a tired man to an international magical smuggling ring." Holmes smiled, exhaling a long plume of blue smoke that momentarily took the shape of a ship before dissolving into the air. "It is the little things, Watson, the trifling details. a 12-hour sleep, a devoted wife pouring coffee, a heavy silver chain. In the end, the most elaborate and arcane crimes are unravelled by the most mundane of human errors. Now, I believe I shall attempt to isolate the illusionary properties of that manticore venom once more. The day is young, and the criminal classes are, thankfully, awake once more. The human spirit is resilient. The sea calls to you still. Return to the windrunner. Let the astral winds blow away the memory of this treachery. When the captain had finally departed, his step heavy but his posture resolute, carrying the invisible weight of a shattered life that he was determined to rebuild, I looked over at Holmes. The morning light was now pouring into our Baker Street rooms, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden sprites. The frantic, high-stakes energy of the night had dissipated, replaced by the quiet, reflective stillness that often followed the resolution of a particularly taxing case. A brilliant piece of deduction, Holmes, from a tired man to an international magical smuggling ring. Holmes smiled, exhaling a long plume of blue smoke that momentarily took the shape of a ship before dissolving into the air. It is the little things, Watson, the trifling details, a 12-hour sleep, a devoted wife pouring coffee, a heavy silver chain. In the end, the most elaborate and arcane crimes are unravelled by the most mundane of human errors. The adversary always underestimates the significance of the routine. He walked over to the sideboard and began to rearrange his array of glass vials and silver instruments with meticulous care. Mrs. Thorne, or whatever her true name may be within the syndicate, believed that the biological bond of the keys and the chemical weight of the somnium lotus were insurmountable. She viewed the captain as a mere biometric terminal, forgetting that even a drugged mind leaves a trail of physical wreckage. It was her very insistence on personal service, the brewing of the coffee, that provided the thread. A more distant conspirator might have escaped my notice, but such devotion in the face of sudden, inexplicable decline is always a red flag to the trained observer. "And the soul gems?" I asked, shrugging off my travel-stained cloak. The harbour guard seemed particularly agitated by their presence. "Rightly so, Watson. Those gems are the batteries of the dark arts. To smuggle them into the heart of London is to bring a keg of gunpowder into a nursery. The legal repercussions for the East India Trading Company will be severe, but for Captain Thorne the cost is far more personal. He has lost a wife and gained a nightmare, yet he walks out with his life and his honour intact." Holmes turned back to his chemical table, his long, thin fingers hovering over a bubbling retort. "Now I believe I shall attempt to isolate the illusionary properties of that manticore venom once more. The day is young, and the criminal classes are, thankfully, awake once more. Stagnation is the only enemy I truly fear, and for one night at least we have held it at bay." Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more stories, be sure to check out my Patreon. The link is in the description below.